The sun hung mercilessly in the bleached sky above the Texas plains, casting long shadows across the dusty road that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Jack Morrison pulled his hat lower over his weathered face, shielding his eyes from the glare as his horse Dakota plodded steadily along the worn path. The year was 1883, and the frontier was still wild, unforgiving, and ruled by those strong enough to claim their piece of it. Jack had been riding for 3 days straight, carrying news of rustlers to the ranchers scattered across the territory. At 35, he was a man shaped by the harsh realities of frontier life. His hands were calloused from years of handling rope and reins, his face lined from squinting against prairie winds, and his heart had grown tough as leather from witnessing more sorrow than any man should bear. He worked as a ranch hand for whoever would pay him fair wages, never staying in one place too long, never forming attachments that might slow him down or break when the inevitable goodbyes came. The sound reached him before he saw them, a woman's voice, cracked and desperate, carrying across the empty landscape like a prayer without hope. Jack's hand instinctively moved to the Colt, .45 at his hip, but as he crested a small rise in the road, what he saw made him forget all thoughts of danger. There, beside a broken-down wagon with one wheel askew, sat a woman and a small child. The woman's dress, once probably a cheerful blue, was now faded and torn. Her dark hair had escaped its pins and hung in tangles around a face that spoke of exhaustion and desperation. The child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, sat pressed against his mother's side, his large eyes hollow with hunger. Their belongings were scattered around them, a few pots, some torn clothing, and what appeared to be the remnants of their life packed into that broken wagon. The woman looked up as Jack approached, and he saw in her eyes the kind of fear that comes from being utterly alone in a world that showed no mercy to the vulnerable. "Please," she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Please, sir, do you have any food? Anything at all? My boy hasn't eaten in 2 days." Jack dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Up close, he could see the full extent of their desperation. The woman's cheeks were sunken, her lips cracked from thirst and exposure. The boy's clothes hung loose on his small frame, and when he looked at Jack, there was no curiosity or energy in his gaze, only the vacant stare of a child who had learned too young what it meant to go without. "Name's Jack Morrison," he said, removing his hat. "What happened here, ma'am?" The woman's eyes filled with tears that she seemed too proud to let fall. "I'm Sarah Chen. This is my son, Tommy. We were traveling to California to meet my husband. He sent for us after he found work in the gold fields. But our wagon broke down 3 days ago, and..." She gestured helplessly at their scattered possessions. "Some men came by yesterday. They took our horse, said we wouldn't be needing it anyway. They took most of our food too." Jack felt something twist in his chest, a familiar anger at the cruelty that seemed to flourish in the lawless spaces between civilization. He'd seen it too many times before, the way the strong preyed upon the weak, leaving broken lives scattered across the frontier like tumbleweeds. But this time, looking at the small boy's face, something else stirred within him, something he'd tried to bury years ago. "Well, Mrs. Chen," Jack said, reaching into his saddlebags, "let's see what we can do about getting some food into you and the boy." He pulled out strips of jerky hardtack and his water canteen. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. As he handed the food to Sarah, her fingers trembled as she took it. "Tommy," she whispered to her son, "eat slowly, baby. Just a little at first." The boy took the jerky with both hands as if it were made of gold, and began to chew with the careful concentration of someone who knew the value of every bite. Sarah watched him eat before taking anything for herself, and in that moment, Jack saw something that reminded him of his own mother, a woman who had gone hungry so her children could eat, who had sacrificed everything for love. "How long since you've eaten, Mrs. Chen?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer from looking at her. "It doesn't matter," she said, but her stomach betrayed her with a low growl. "Tommy needs it more." Jack knelt down in the dust beside them. "Mom, with respect, you can't take care of the boy if you don't take care of yourself. Please, eat something." As Sarah finally began to eat, Jack examined their broken wagon. The axle was cracked beyond repair, and one wheel had lost half its spokes. Even if he could fix it, they had no horse to pull it, and their supplies were nearly gone. The nearest town was Milfield, about 20 miles north, but in their condition on foot, they'd never make it. "Mrs. Chen," Jack said, returning to where they sat, "I need to ask you something straight. Do you have any money left? Anything of value?" Sarah's face flushed with shame. The men took what little money we had. I have my wedding ring, but… She touched the simple gold band on her finger. It's all I have left of my husband. Jack looked at the ring, then at her face, then at Tommy, who had fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder, the jerky still clutched in his small fist. In that moment, Jack Morrison made a decision that would change not just their lives, but his own in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Keep your ring, he said quietly. I'm going to take you both to Milfield. There's a family there, the Hendersons, who run a boarding house. They're good people. They'll give you a place to stay while we figure out how to get you to California. I can't pay you, Sarah said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I have nothing to give you. I'm not asking for payment, Jack replied. He looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her eyes. Can you ride? I can try. Jack helped Sarah onto Dakota's back, then carefully lifted Tommy and placed him in front of his mother. The boy was so light that Jack felt another surge of anger at the men who had left them stranded. He would walk alongside, leading the horse, making sure they didn't fall. The journey to Milfield took them the rest of that day and into the evening. Jack walked the entire distance, occasionally stopping to let Sarah and Tommy rest or take water. As they traveled, Sarah began to tell him about her life, how she'd met her husband in Missouri, how they'd dreamed of making a new start in California, how the journey west had been harder than they'd ever imagined. My husband's letters stopped coming 3 months ago, she admitted as they rested beside a creek. I don't even know if he's still alive, but I had to try to reach him. I couldn't stay in Missouri with nothing left there for us. Jack nodded, understanding the kind of desperation that drove people west, chasing hope across endless miles of harsh country. He'd been running from his own demons when he'd first come to Texas, though his reasons had been different. What about you, Mr. Morrison? Sarah asked. Do you have family? Jack was quiet for a long moment, watching Tommy play with pebbles by the water's edge. I had a wife and daughter once, he said finally. Fever took them both during a hard winter. That was 7 years ago. I'm sorry, Sarah said softly. It's why I keep moving, Jack admitted. Easier that way. Less chance of… He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. When they finally reached Milfield as the sun was setting, Jack led them straight to the Henderson boarding house. Mary Henderson, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, took one look at Sarah and Tommy and immediately ushered them inside, asking no questions beyond what they needed to be comfortable. Her husband, Bill, helped Jack stable Dakota and offered him a room for the night. Over dinner, the first real meal Sarah and Tommy had eaten in days, Jack explained their situation. The Hendersons listened without judgment, occasionally exchanging glances that spoke of years of partnership and shared compassion. They can stay here as long as they need, Mary said firmly. We've got room, and the boy needs time to get his strength back before traveling anywhere. I can pay for their room and board for a week, Jack offered, reaching for his money pouch. That's generous of you, Jack, Bill said, but what happens after a week? They still won't have a way to get to California, and we both know there's no guarantee her husband is even alive. Jack stared down at his plate, knowing Bill was right. A week's charity wouldn't solve their fundamental problem. Sarah needed a permanent solution, not just temporary relief. But what could he offer? He was just a drifting cowboy with no home, no steady income, and a heart he'd sworn to keep closed. That night, Jack lay awake in the small room above the boarding house, listening to the sounds of the frontier town settling into sleep. Through the thin walls, he could hear Tommy coughing, a deep, raspy sound that spoke of too many cold nights and too little food. He heard Sarah's gentle voice comforting her son, singing a soft lullaby that reminded Jack painfully of his own wife's voice. The next morning, Jack found Sarah in the boarding house kitchen, helping Mary with breakfast preparations. Tommy was playing on the floor with some wooden toys that Mary had found for him, and for the first time since Jack had found them, the boy actually looked like a child instead of a miniature survivor. Mrs. Chen, Jack said, I've been thinking about your situation. Sarah looked up from the bread she was kneading, flour dusting her hands. In the warm kitchen light, with some color back in her cheeks from a good night's sleep and a proper meal, Jack could see that she was still a young woman, probably no more than 25. The hardships of the trail had aged her, but underneath the exhaustion was someone who had once laughed easily and loved deeply. I know what you're going to say, Sarah said quietly. That I need to be realistic. That I should give up on finding my husband and figure out how to build a life here. Actually, Jack said, surprising himself with his words, I was going to offer to take you to California. Sarah's hands stilled on the dough. Mr. Morrison, you've already done more than enough? Hear me out? Jack interrupted. I've got enough saved to buy supplies for the journey. I know the trails know which routes are safest. It would take us about 6 weeks to get there, maybe less if we make good time. Why would you do this? Sarah asked, her eyes searching his face. You don't even know us? Jack looked down at Tommy, who was building something with his wooden blocks, his tongue poking out in concentration. Maybe that's exactly why I need to do it. The truth was, Jack didn't fully understand his own motivations. All he knew was that walking away from Sarah and Tommy felt impossible. When he'd found them on that dusty road, something in his carefully constructed solitary life had shifted. For 7 years he'd kept moving, kept his heart locked away, told himself that caring led only to loss. But seeing Tommy's hunger, Sarah's quiet dignity in the face of desperation, had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead. The trail to California is dangerous, Sarah said. There are river crossings, mountain passes, Indians, outlaws, and Tommy's still weak. What if something happens to us? You'd blame yourself. Maybe, Jack acknowledged. But if I don't try to help you, if I just walk away and something happens to you here, I'll blame myself for that too. They were interrupted by Bill Henderson, who came into the kitchen with news that would change everything. Jack, there's a man in the saloon asking about you. Says he's got a job offer. Might be worth hearing what he has to say. The man turned out to be Thomas Garrett, a wealthy rancher from California who owned thousands of acres in the Sacramento Valley. He was a big man in his 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He'd heard about Jack's reputation as an honest, reliable hand and was offering him a job as foreman of his ranch. It's good work, Garrett explained as they sat in the boarding house parlor. Steady pay, your own house on the property, and California's got opportunities for a man with your skills. I'm heading back west with a supply train next week. You could ride with us. Jack listened to the offer, aware that Sarah was in the kitchen, probably hearing every word. A steady job, a house, security. Everything he'd told himself he didn't want because he couldn't risk losing it. But now, with Sarah and Tommy's faces in his mind, the idea of having something stable to offer seemed suddenly important. Mr. Garrett, Jack said slowly, would your offer extend to a woman and her child, Mrs. Chen here is trying to get to California to find her husband. Garrett looked toward the kitchen, where Sarah had appeared in the doorway, Tommy clinging to her skirts. She married. Yes, sir. Her husband went ahead to find work in the gold fields. Well, I suppose we could find room in the wagon train for 2 more. Can't promise anything about finding her husband, but at least she'd get to California safely. That evening, as Sarah put Tommy to bed in their room at the boarding house, Jack stood on the front porch, smoking and watching the stars emerge in the vast prairie sky. Sarah joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cool night air. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. Take that job, I mean. You shouldn't change your whole life for strangers. Maybe it's time I changed my life anyway, Jack replied. I've been drifting for 7 years, telling myself I was free, but maybe I was just running. From what? Jack was quiet for a long moment. From the possibility of caring about someone again, of having something to lose. Sarah studied his profile in the dim light from the boarding house windows. And now I think maybe having something to lose is better than having nothing at all. The week that followed was a whirlwind of preparation. Jack sold his horse Dakota to Bill Henderson, knowing he'd be riding with Garrett's supply train. He bought supplies for the journey, including proper clothes for Tommy and Sarah. Most importantly, he sent a telegram to San Francisco, hiring a detective to search for news of Sarah's husband in the California gold fields. Sarah spent her days helping Mary Henderson with the boarding house chores, slowly regaining her strength. Tommy began to fill out, his cheeks growing round again, his laughter returning as he played with the other children in town. Jack found himself stopping by the boarding house several times a day, ostensibly to check on their preparations but really just to see them, to reassure himself they were safe and well. One afternoon, as Jack was teaching Tommy to whittle a wooden horse, Sarah sat down beside them on the boarding house steps. Jack, she said, using his first name for the first time, what if we get to California and find that my husband is dead? What then? Jack's hand stilled on the whittling knife. It was a question they'd all been avoiding, but it hung over them like a storm cloud on the horizon. "Then we'll figure it out," he said simply. "Whatever happens, you and Tommy won't face it alone." "That's not fair to you," Sarah protested. "You're already giving up your freedom, taking a job you might not want, all for people you barely know." "Sarah," Jack said, looking directly into her eyes, "I want you to understand something. 7 years ago, when I lost my family, I thought my life was over. I thought the best I could hope for was to just keep moving, keep working until I was too old or too tired to go on. But these past weeks, watching Tommy get strong again, seeing you smile, it's reminded me that there are different kinds of life, different ways to build something meaningful." Tommy looked up from his whittling. "Are you going to be my papa now?" The innocent question hung in the air between them. Jack felt his chest tighten, while Sarah's cheeks flushed red. "Tommy," Sarah said gently, "Mr. Jack is our friend. He's helping us find your real papa." "But what if we can't find him?" Tommy persisted with a child's logic. "Then can Mr. Jack be my papa?" Jack knelt down to Tommy's level. "Tommy, your papa loves you very much wherever he is. And we're going to do everything we can to find him. But no matter what happens, I promise you'll always have people who care about you. Can you believe that?" Tommy nodded solemnly, then went back to his whittling, satisfied with the adult's promise in the way only a child could be. The supply train left Milfield on a crisp morning in early October. Garrett had assembled a formidable group for the journey. 20 wagons loaded with supplies, 30 riders, and families relocating to California for various reasons. Sarah and Tommy rode in one of the family wagons, while Jack rode alongside as one of Garrett's scouts. The journey west tested them all. They crossed swollen rivers where Tommy clung to his mother in terror as the wagon swayed and pitched. They climbed mountain passes where the air grew thin and cold, and Tommy developed a cough that kept Sarah awake with worry. They faced a brief encounter with hostile Indians that was resolved through negotiation rather than violence, but left everyone shaken. Through it all, Jack found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. His protective instincts, dormant for so long, roared back to life. He found himself riding closer to Sarah's wagon during dangerous passages, checking on Tommy's health, sharing his own food when supplies ran low. More than that, he found himself planning for a future beyond just completing the journey. Sarah noticed the change too. The hard, distant man who had found them by the roadside was gradually replaced by someone warmer, more engaged with the world around him. She watched him teach Tommy to ride, saw him patiently answer the boys' endless questions about the trail, the animals they saw, the vast landscape they were crossing. "He's good with children," observed Martha Garrett, the rancher's wife, as they sat by the campfire one evening. "Does he have any of his own?" "He did once," Sarah replied quietly. "He lost them? And you?" "Have you heard anything from your husband?" Sarah shook her head. "Jack hired a detective to search for him in California. We should hear something when we reach Sacramento." Martha studied Sarah's face in the firelight. "And if the news isn't what you're hoping for?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching Jack show Tommy how to properly bank a campfire. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been so focused on finding my husband, on completing this journey, that I haven't let myself think beyond that." "Sometimes," Martha said gently, "life gives us second chances we never expected. The question is whether we're brave enough to take them." That night, as the camp settled into sleep, Sarah lay in her bedroll with Tommy curled against her side, listening to the sounds of the frontier night, somewhere nearby. She could hear Jack talking quietly with the other men about the road ahead, the weather, the condition of their supplies. His voice had become a source of comfort to her, a steady presence in the uncertainty of their journey. What frightened her was how natural it had begun to feel, this life they'd constructed around their temporary circumstances. Tommy had begun calling Jack Uncle Jack, and clearly adored him. She herself had started relying on Jack's judgment, his protection, his quiet strength. But it was all built on the foundation of her search for her husband, and she couldn't shake the feeling that when they reached California, everything would change. 6 weeks after leaving Milfield, Garrett's supply train crested a hill and saw the sprawling valley of Sacramento spread out below them. The sight of the growing city, with its bustling streets and smoking chimneys, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. After months of travel, hardship, and uncertainty, they had finally reached their destination. Jack rode up beside the wagon where Sarah and Tommy sat staring at their new home. "We made it," he said simply. "We made it," Sarah echoed. but there was more uncertainty than triumph in her voice. They made camp outside the city that night, planning to enter Sacramento the next morning. Jack had arranged to meet with the detective he'd hired, while Sarah would begin the process of searching for any trace of her husband in the gold fields. As the sun set over the California Valley, Jack found Sarah standing apart from the camp, looking toward the distant mountains where the gold fields lay. "Scared?" he asked, joining her. "Terrified," she admitted. "What if I find him? What if I don't? Either way, everything changes tomorrow." "Not everything," Jack said. "Tommy will still need his mother. You'll still be the strongest person I've ever known, and you'll still have friends who care about you." Sarah turned to look at him, this man who had changed her life and Tommy's simply by being willing to see their need and respond to it. "Jack, whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know." "Don't," Jack interrupted gently. "Don't say anything you might regret. Wait until we know what we're facing." But Sarah shook her head. "No, I need to say this now. You saved our lives. Not just from hunger or cold or danger, but from despair. You gave me back hope when I'd lost everything. Whatever the future holds, I'll never forget that." Jack reached out and took her hand, holding it gently in his calloused fingers. "Sarah, you and Tommy saved me too. I just didn't realize I needed saving until I found you." The next morning, they entered Sacramento together. The city was booming with gold rush prosperity, full of prospectors, merchants, and families seeking their fortunes. Jack left Sarah and Tommy at a respectable boarding house while he went to meet with Detective Morrison, the man he'd hired to search for Sarah's husband. The news was not what Sarah had hoped for. Peter Chen had died 4 months earlier in a mining accident near Nevada City. The detective had located his grave and had even recovered a small amount of gold dust that Peter had left with a friend, along with a letter addressed to Sarah. Jack sat in the detective's office, holding the letter and feeling the weight of the moment. In a few minutes, he would have to return to Sarah and Tommy and deliver news that would shatter their hopes but also, perhaps, set them free to build a new life. When he returned to the boarding house, Sarah took one look at his face and knew. She sank into a chair, her hand pressed to her mouth, while Tommy continued playing with his wooden toys, unaware that his world had just shifted forever. "He's dead, isn't he?" she whispered. Jack nodded, then knelt beside her chair and handed her the letter. "He left this for you, and there's some money, enough to get you started here." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the letter. Peter's familiar handwriting blurred through her tears as she read his words of love, his hopes for their reunion, his plans for the life they would build together in California. At the end, he had written, "If something happens to me before you arrive, know that my greatest wish is for you and Tommy to find happiness. Don't mourn too long, my beloved Sarah. Live fully, love again, and know that wherever I am, I want nothing more than your joy." When Sarah finished reading, she sat in silence for several minutes, tears streaming down her face. Tommy, sensing his mother's distress, came to stand beside her chair. "Mama, are you sad?" Sarah gathered her son into her arms, holding him tightly. "Yes, baby, I'm sad. Papa won't be coming home. Is Papa in heaven now?" Tommy asked, his 4-year-old understanding of death simple and accepting. "Yes, sweetheart, Papa is in heaven." Tommy was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Can Uncle Jack be my papa now?" The question hung in the air like sunlight streaming through the boarding house windows. Sarah looked at Jack, who was standing awkwardly by the door, his hat in his hands, clearly struggling with his own emotions. "Tommy," Sarah said gently, "Uncle Jack has his own life, his own job to start. We can't just assume." "Actually," Jack interrupted, his voice rough with emotion, "if you'll have me, I'd be honored to be Tommy's papa. And your husband, if you'll marry me." Sarah stared at him in shock. "Jack, you don't have to do this out of obligation or pity. We'll be fine on our own." "That's not why I'm asking," Jack said, moving closer. "I'm asking because somewhere between finding you on that road and getting here, I fell in love with you. Both of you. I know it's soon. I know the circumstances are complicated, but Sarah, I can't imagine my life without you and Tommy in it." Sarah stood up, still holding Tommy, her eyes searching Jack's face. "Are you sure? Really sure? Because if we do this, there's no going back. We'll be a family, with all the mess and responsibility and heartache that comes with it." "I've never been more sure of anything," Jack said. "I spent 7 years running from the idea of family because I was afraid of losing it again. But you taught me that the risk is worth it, that love is worth it. 3 months later, on a warm spring morning in 1884, Jack Morrison married Sarah Chen in a simple ceremony in Sacramento's newest church. Tommy, dressed in his first real suit, served as ring bearer, solemnly carrying the simple gold bands that would bind their new family together. Jack's job as foreman of Garrett's ranch provided them with a comfortable house on the property, surrounded by rolling hills and oak trees. Sarah established a small garden where she grew vegetables and flowers, creating beauty in their corner of the vast California landscape. Tommy thrived in their new life, growing strong and healthy, learning to ride horses, and help with ranch work under Jack's patient guidance. The transformation in Jack was remarkable. The hard, distant cowboy who had drifted through life without attachments became a devoted husband and father. He taught Tommy to ride, to rope cattle, to read the weather and the land. He held Sarah through the nights when grief for her first husband would overwhelm her, understanding that love could coexist with loss. Sarah, too, had changed. The desperate woman begging for food by the roadside had become the heart of their small community. She organized school lessons for the ranch children, tended to sick workers and their families, and brought warmth and grace to their frontier home. She had learned to love again without forgetting the love she had lost, understanding that the human heart was vast enough to hold both gratitude for the past and hope for the future. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the California hills gold, Tommy ran up from where he'd been playing with the ranch dogs. "Papa Jack," he said, climbing onto Jack's lap, "tell me again about how you found Mama and me." Jack smiled, wrapping his arms around the boy who had become his son in every way that mattered. "Well, I was riding along this dusty road, and I heard voices calling for help." As Jack began the familiar story, Sarah reached over and took his hand. In the distance, cattle lowed softly in the pastures, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. It was a scene of perfect domestic contentment, built from tragedy and transformed by love. But what made it truly remarkable was not the happiness they had found, but the journey that had brought them to it. A desperate mother's cry for help by the roadside had awakened something in a hardened cowboy's heart. A willingness to share his last food had led to a willingness to share his life. A temporary act of kindness had grown into a permanent commitment to love. Later that night, after Tommy had been tucked into bed and the house had settled into peaceful quiet, Jack and Sarah sat together in their small parlor, reading by lamplight. Sarah was mending one of Tommy's shirts while Jack reviewed the ranch's accounts. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" Sarah asked suddenly. Jack looked up from his ledger. "Every day. And every day I'm grateful I did." "I used to think that meeting you was lucky," Sarah said, setting down her mending. "But I've realized it wasn't luck at all. It was choice. You chose to stop, chose to help, chose to care. And those choices changed everything." Jack closed his ledger and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. The choice to stop was easy. It was the choice to stay that was hard. And now? Jack pulled her closer, feeling the solid reality of their life together, the weight of their shared responsibilities and shared love. "Now I know that the hardest choices are often the most worthwhile ones." Outside, the California night was vast and star-filled, full of possibilities and promise. Inside their small house on Garrett's ranch, a family slept peacefully, a family that had been created not by blood or tradition, but by need, compassion, and the remarkable capacity of the human heart to heal and grow. The frontier was still wild and often cruel, but within their small circle of love, Sarah, Jack, and Tommy had created something precious and lasting. They had learned that family could be chosen, that love could be rebuilt, and that sometimes the most profound changes in life began with the simplest acts of kindness. As the years passed, their story would become one of the many legends of the American West, not of gunfights or gold strikes, but of something far more valuable. It was the story of how a cowboy's willingness to share his last meal with strangers had grown into a love that would last a lifetime, and how the cries of a hungry mother and child by the roadside had called forth not just immediate aid, but a complete transformation of 3 lives. In the end, that may be the most powerful truth of the frontier experience, that in a land where survival often depended on individual strength and self-reliance, it was acts of generosity, compassion, and love that created the most lasting legacies. Jack Morrison had set out to save a woman and child he found in distress, but in saving them, he had ultimately saved himself, discovering that a life shared was infinitely richer than a life lived alone. Their story became a testament to the idea that even in the harshest circumstances, even when life has stripped away everything you thought you needed, there is always the possibility of new beginnings, second chances, and the redemptive power of human kindness. Sometimes the greatest adventures are not about conquering new territories, but about opening your heart to the possibility that strangers might become family, that temporary kindness might grow into permanent love, and that the road you travel might be less important than the people you choose to travel with. In the vast expanse of the American West, where individual stories often disappeared into the enormity of the landscape, the tale of Jack Morrison, Sarah Chen, and little Tommy became a reminder that the most important journeys are measured not in miles, but in the distance the heart travels from loneliness to love, from fear to trust, from despair to hope. And it all began with a cowboy who heard cries for help by the roadside and chose to stop.